I am Ijmal Haider, and I'm the host of the Hidden Spoons podcast presented by Gali Health. This is actually an interview that was done prior to us recording Hidden Spoons. Joe Hinksman, a fellow Gali ambassador, interviewed me on what it was like to be a man in the IBD world and what my experiences were like within the community and with the illness. And this is just giving you guys a preview of my backstory before we get into the Hidden Spoons podcast. So I hope you guys enjoy it and keep an eye out for the Hidden Spoons podcast. Thank you.
All right, hello listeners, and welcome to our very first episode of Man Up to IBD. I'm your host, Joe Hinksman. I'm a patient living with Crohn's disease, a chronic illness advocate, and a grateful ambassador for Gali Health. For those of you who don't know, IBD, or inflammatory bowel disease, is a blanket term for chronic and incurable illnesses such as Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. Gali Health is on a mission to make sure nobody ever feels isolated, lost, or powerless in the face of existing or potential disease. That's why they've developed an artificially intelligent health assistant who lives in your phone and helps you keep feeling well every day. If you'd like to know more about how Gali may be able to help you, there's some information down in the notes for you to go check out. Gali is, of course, inclusive of all ages and genders, but for the purpose of this podcast, it's to hear the voices less heard in the chronic illness community. In a space dominantly influenced by women, we'd like to hear from the guys. Today we're going to be chatting with Ijmal Haider and about how he mans up to IBD. Ijmal Haider is a chronic illness advocate, a blogger, and a fellow podcast host. So I'm happy to have him on the show today to hear what he's got to say. So Ijmal, how you doing, buddy?
Good, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no sweat, man.
It's an honor to be on your first ever episode.
I know, it's rather exciting, isn't it?
I feel like it's long overdue. I feel like you've been in the works for this for a long time, and it's nice to see it come into fruition.
Yeah, it's funny. We've been connected on Instagram for quite some time. We've had lots of talks about having a talk or a podcast and stuff, and now here we are. Yeah, so bro, I love your content. You're obviously passionate about sharing your story, advocating for chronic illness, and just, creating spaces for people to connect and come together. I absolutely love that. I was reading a little bit of your blog. I think it's super awesome. But let's start with, chronic illness and IBD aside. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Introduce yourself to our listeners.
My name is Ishmael Haider, and I have ulcerative colitis, which is another form of inflammatory bowel disease. It's just in a different area than Crohn's. It's kind of isolated to the descending colon and the rectum. And yeah, so I've been diagnosed almost 5 years now. And I think on my journey, I've kind of just, for the first couple of years was really tough, just trying to navigate and figure out how to handle it, because there's a lot of different things that come along with having a chronic illness. It's not just about you have an illness and then you start on medication. It's so much more than that. There's a mental health side of it that you're not even anticipating, and you kind of have to be your own advocate. So for the first 2 years, I struggled a lot with like the mental health side of it and struggling to feel like myself. And then I had found myself blogging about it, which led to a lot of people reaching out and sharing their own stories or telling me how my story was inspiring them. And it's kind of just snowballed from there. And I've done a few different things. Like I have had a YouTube show. We have a podcast, both which are called Help Us. And then I had started a thing called Hidden Spoons, which is showing the stories of other people with chronic illnesses and how they found positivity through it, just so I could create kind of an area just like Joe's doing here to create a positive light on what it's like to deal with chronic illness and understanding that like there are other people, and so you don't feel as alone, because it can be quite isolating. And then I also will be joining the Gali Health team here, and I'm also the president for our local chapter for the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation.
That's amazing, man. Yeah, you got a lot on the go. So why don't you tell me a little bit about how you got diagnosed?
Well, so that was back in summer of 2015. I had lost a lot of weight in the matter of like a month. It was about 20, 25 pounds. which was super concerning, obviously. And I went and saw my doctor about it. And I was going through a really stressful time then. So I was like, oh, maybe it's just like stress related. I was working a lot and I was going through like some other personal struggles. And so I went and saw my doctor and he was like, this does sound, he's like, it could be stress, but it could be a little bit more serious than that. So I would like you to see a specialist. And he um, lined me up with a specialist. And that was back in June of 2015. And then by August 2015, I met with the specialist. And, you know, I went and told her what was going on. And her first thought was, like, this sounds like it's something a little bit more serious. She's like, it sounds a little bit more like colon cancer. She's like, but we won't know until you get a scope and will book you in for a scope, which wasn't until November. So from August till November of 2015, I was just left to my own devices and with my own mind and the internet, which is can be a toxic place. So she had told me that she suspected it could be colon cancer. So I kept that to myself. I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell friends, family. I was like, I'm not going to tell anybody until I know for sure. But in that period, I did a lot of my own research, and of course, I was just like terrified. But then in November of 2015, we had my first scope, and she let me know that it was ulcerative colitis. I was given a bunch of medications and kind of just like sent on your way. It was like a pamphlet, some medications, and yeah, I didn't really know what ulcerative colitis was. I didn't understand how to manage it. She was just like, just take this medication. So to me, I was like, oh, all right, I just have to take this medication and I'll be all right. But you know, then you start reading up on it, then you start learning about things. Then you get on prednisone, and you have the ups and downs, and you have like the side effects, and it just takes a big toll on you, and you start kind of feeling beaten down. And yeah, and I think that's kind of where the journey started for me. And then for the first 2 years, it was just kind of like I felt like the disease had defined who I was.
Yeah, I think it's pretty common when I know for myself, finding out that something was seriously wrong with my health, it becomes the center focus and center stage, of life. Man, like I couldn't imagine sitting on that, having that, sitting there waiting for an answer and what's going on with your health and knowing that it's something serious and then catastrophizing that it could be something, extremely serious that could be life threatening. What was it like sitting on that and not sharing that with anybody?
It was tough because one, I feel like it was probably not the smartest thing to tell somebody that hey, it sounds like it's colon cancer. She's a great doctor. Like I love her. I think sometimes doctors may just lack a little bit of bedside manner, but she's amazing. And uh, yeah, it was just an interesting time. I guess I was working a lot. I was going through transition through my career as well, and through a relationship, and so I had a lot on my plate at the moment too. And it was just like one more thing added to that. And yeah, just sitting on it was tough, and you sat there tight-lipped because I was like, I don't want to stress anybody else out because I feel like if everyone else is stressed about it, I'm going to get more stressed about it, and I can like compartmentalize it for the time being, which you learn when you have a chronic illness that compartmentalizing and suppressing your feelings isn't always the best thing because it can lead to more stress, and that I had to learn the hard way after the first 2 years.
True that. So you were mentioning, work and stuff, IBD aside and outside of the chronic illness, what is it that you do for work? Want to tell me a little bit about what life looks like outside of that?
Outside of all the chronic illness stuff, I own my own business. So I do renovations and design, whether it's commercial spaces or residential spaces. Um, and yeah, so I'm kind of always on the go. And I started that I've worked in the industry for 11 years, but I started my own business a little over 2 years ago. And in those 2 years, we've done about 15 projects. So, whether it's full houses or just renovations, like we've kind of just been doing that, and then got some other things in the works too, like we have a furniture line that we've been working on it's like a custom furniture line with like exotic woods and stuff. Um, yeah, so that's what I do on the side.
That's incredible, man. Lots of hard work, eh?
It's definitely a lot of work, but I find that for me, like I'm a one, I'm an extrovert, and two, I'm a little bit like a workaholic, and something that keeps my mind off my illness too is keeping myself busy and keeping my mind busy. So doing something I'm super passionate about and working really hard at it is something that is kind of, it's like a double-edged sword because yeah, you work too hard. It's like a fine balance. If you work too hard, it can be bad for your illness, but if I'm not working enough, that can also be bad for my illness. So I'm trying to find that like sweet spot where I can work enough and be content.
Right.
Yeah,
Find something that you love and you'll never work a day in your life unless you have chronic illness, then.
exactly.
So, as a man with IBD, someone who owns his own business, somebody who's working hard, have you found yourself affected by the expectations from friends or family or employers, kind of that status quo around men where you should just man up and take care of business despite your illness? Or have you found that people in your life are usually pretty, what's the word I'm looking for here? They allow you to take the space you need with your illness.
For the most part, I feel like people allow me to take the space, but I think it was a learning curve for everybody to understand that I have my own process of how I want to handle my illness. So, you know, because traditionally and socially, like, as men, we tend to get socialized to kind of suppress our feelings and not really share things and not show vulnerability. And that kind of just is how we're brought up. It's kind of like if you're a man, you're just not supposed to show those things. I was fortunate enough that I grew up with a father that was just like, you know what, like feel what you feel, say how you feel, like don't worry about it. I grew up talking about my feelings with him and stuff, so it wasn't anything that was too um, foreign, but it was still a little bit weird to then take what I've grown up with in that home environment and be able to eh, um, use it in my everyday life, whether, like you said, in my career or whether it's in my social networks. Because just because I grew up that way doesn't mean that that's still what's the norm in society. So I had to find a way to figure out how to have my voice and be vulnerable. And, it's like people were a little bit taken aback at first, especially when I started Razzie blog. People were like, oh, like, thanks so much for sharing it. But a lot of people in my life were like, oh, we didn't know you felt that way. We didn't know that you were going through those things because I was so conditioned to not share that outside of my like family unit. So people within my friends didn't necessarily know how hard the illness was hitting me. So they were all really receptive to it, but I think everybody was a little bit shocked that those are the feelings I was having and I wasn't really sharing them. So
Yeah, so I find that really interesting because I was kind of met with the exact same reaction from my friends and family because I grew up the same way, not talking about things, kind of stuff your feelings, don't be a crybaby, man up, blah, blah, blah. And so when I created my Instagram and started talking about these things and being so candid with what I was feeling, I was also met with that, like, whoa, man, like, some of my buddies were like, that's way too much information. I would never share that, and despite what the societal status quo tells us, men have just as many fears, anxieties, emotional blocks, and feelings as anybody else, right? What is it about what you do and how you advocate and how you share that kind of gets you out of bed in the morning and gets you moving and drives you to be consistent?
I think the thing that drives me the most to be consistent is the ability to help people. I think originally when I started the blog, it was all about getting feelings off my chest. So I was seeing a therapist and I told her about like just the negative feelings I was having towards my illness and like the resentment I felt and the isolation and the shame and the stigma and all of that. And she was like, I feel like you should journal. And I was like, I'm not one, I've never been one to just like sit and like write in a book my feelings. So I was like, that seems a little bit weird to me. And for some reason, writing it on the internet or whatever didn't feel that weird. I was like, you know what, like I can put this out there. If somebody reads it, great. If somebody doesn't matter. As long as I'm getting it off my chest, because literally, if it's off my chest, it's out of my head, and it's one less thing that I have to stress about because I've been able to vocalize it. So that's where it started, and it was just became like, I don't know, it was just like this cathartic thing. And then all of a sudden, I had people reaching out to me, and they would share their stories, and I started realizing the value in sharing a story because someone has taken the time out of their day to share their story with me, which is so honoring. Like somebody felt I was worthy enough for them to share their story because I know that it took a lot for me to share my story. And if somebody's able to share their story with me, it means a lot. And then when people started telling me that, what I was doing was helping them find positivity or was helping them find uh, a voice or helping them not feel so alone, that was kind of what drives me every day to continue doing this consistently, is knowing that I'm hopefully able to help one person, even if it's just one person a day. I don't care. Like if my post only has one person that feels something towards it and feels better about themselves, like it's all worth it at the end. And that helps me feel better too.
I think that's an amazing attitude.
Thanks.
Throughout your journey, obviously, we're met with hurdles and we're met with challenges. Do you have any stories for us about some of your biggest hurdles and maybe how you overcame them?
Yeah, I think the biggest hurdle that I ever had in this entire journey was probably getting over my ego. Because the thing is, when, for me,
As men, we all have them.
exactly. And the thing is, no matter how I grew up or how like open and like cool my parents are, it was still about, there's always that ego, you feel less than if you're not able to do what you were doing before. So it was almost like I started mourning this life that used to exist pre chronic illness. But the reality was that that life was still there. And just because you have an illness doesn't mean you are no longer who you were. And just because you have an illness doesn't mean that your illness defines who you are. So those were kind of the biggest hurdles I had to overcome, was understanding that I was not my illness. My illness was something I had, but it wasn't something I was. And that took years. And it's still something I struggle with because it's not necessarily something we are prepared for in life. Nobody's sitting there preparing to get sick. Nobody's there preparing to have a chronic illness. Nobody's preparing to be on heavy medications. And, the biggest thing is just being able to detach yourself from that illness and understand that you're still who you were. Like you haven't changed. Your circumstances may have changed, and the way that you live your life may have to change a little bit, and you may have to make adjustments, and you may have to figure out your new normal, but you yourself are still going to fundamentally be the same person.
I love how you articulated that.
Thank you.
I think it's so important to separate the difference, because it's so easy to become wrapped up in your illness, and it becomes your reasons, it becomes your excuses, it becomes who you are and why you do things, and it takes up all of your time and all of your bandwidth.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's so important to stay connected with yourself and keep an eye on that relationship with your ego, because your illness loves grabbing onto your ego and running with it. Right.
100%. And then aside from that as being a hurdle, it was a bit of a hurdle to try and figure out how to navigate myself in like a professional setting as well. Because the thing is, like, if you got to go to the bathroom, you got to go to the bathroom, and
now,
yeah, you got to go now. And like, you can't hold it all the time. Like you just got to go, and you got to go, and it's not good for you to hold it either. So
no.
in professional settings, like, I'm very forthcoming, whether it's with clients or whether it's, if I'm in a meeting or something, I let people know, like, hey, like, I'm a little under the weather. Or if it's like with clients, I'm very forthcoming. I'm like, hey, so I do have chronic illness, and I do sometimes, like, I may, like, it may slow down the process a little bit, but they've always been super understanding to it. And, they're always really curious. And the thing is, so many people don't actually know what IBD is. And that's another thing that I've learned in the last 5 years, is that considering I didn't really know what it was prior to being diagnosed with it, I'm not surprised that people don't know what it is. But it's so many people are affected by it, but so little information is out there for people to know what it is. It's not considered. People just it's almost like a taboo topic because people are like, oh man, it's like a disease about bowels, so we don't really talk about it. It's like shameful, and it's like, fuck it. Like, I hope you don't care if I swear, but it's like, fuck it. Like,
No, we're
I have
good.
like zero shame at this point, and I will talk to you about anything and everything that goes on with me, um, because I think it's just important that if there isn't enough information out there on the internet and stuff, that I'm still advocating giving people the information.
For sure. I'm going to take advantage of what you said.
Sure.
Do you have what is a funny and embarrassing story regarding having to go to the bathroom and it being an inappropriate time?
Okay, so right at the beginning of this year, I went to Europe, and so I was in Santorini, and Santorini's kind of like shut down. It was like off season, so we were in Oya, which is like that, like the most beautiful part of Santorini, and it was kind of shut down. Everything was just being like renovated and stuff in preparation for the summer season. So we're kind of like walking along, and oh shit, like I had to go to the bathroom so bad, and I was like, I didn't even, there was nobody around that I could ask where a bathroom was. There was like nothing. And here I am, I'm just like running up and down. And like the thing is, when you gotta go and it's like IBD related, you're like sweating. It's like this weird like cold sweat that you've all of a sudden got, and you're like nervous. And I
Existential
yeah,
terror.
and then there's like random like donkeys just like around, and then there's just like dogs, like stray dogs everywhere, but there's like no people. And I found this bathroom under this clock tower, and I and the first one I went into, no toilet paper, and I was like, fuck. And then I went into the other one, and it was just a nightmare. The other one had toilet paper, but I had like people all of a sudden, like now that I'm in the bathroom, people are trying to get into it. I'm like, where the fuck did all you people come from? Like there was nobody, and now that I'm in the bathroom, people keep like trying to get into it, and it was just like a stall. It wasn't like a public bathroom. There was just a stall under this clock tower that I'm sitting in, and people would just keep trying to get into it. And I'm like, where the fuck did all these people come from? Because they weren't here when I needed to ask someone where the bathroom was. So
Funny how that works.
yeah,
Eh?
it's and yeah, I find it it happens in the most inopportune times. It's not like I was at the hotel. It's not like I was anywhere like a restaurant or anything. Of course, it's like in the abandoned place where I'm dealing with stray dogs and donkeys and like yeah. So I wouldn't say it's embarrassing. It takes a lot to embarrass me, but it's more of like the situational comedy where it's like, how the fuck did I end up in this situation? Like, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny how IBD likes to attack sometimes.
yeah.
Eh?
And then with all this like COVID stuff, it's kind of like you can't use public restrooms anymore. So that in itself is like a little bit more. It's like you have to be really strategic about planning your day. You're like, okay, like I'm gonna not leave home until I have to go to the bathroom because then I know I've got a window of time to like go do my running around and do the stuff I need to do before I'll have to go again.
Right. I want to keep it short about COVID just because it's the hot topic that everybody's talking about
Yeah, of course.
everywhere. But how has COVID been impacting you, as far as your IBD and being concerned for your health is concerned?
For me personally, the thing that I do is I just try to practice safety as much as possible. I mean, for the first month and a bit, I was like, I didn't leave home. It's just like I was home. I wouldn't go to the grocery store or anything. Like I'd order my groceries and stuff. And like as time's gone on, I've kind of started going to the grocery store. You have to wear a mask and you use hand sanitizer and everything. But I think it's just it was another obstacle is I started finding myself getting really like anxious about it in the first month, as if like, oh my god, like this is my new normal, this is the life. And then I found myself going back into that space that I did when I first was diagnosed with IBD, and like just a headspace. And I was like, okay, like I can't let myself go back to that space again. So I have to understand that this is a temporary thing. We're all in this together. We're all going to figure it out. Um, I have to trust that people out there are going to be safe. And so I remember like the first time that I went out to the grocery store, I was like super anxious and I was like really nervous. And um, but as long as everybody is practicing social distancing, practicing like um, healthy habits, I think I'm good. That's how I'm trying to, and that's how I'm choosing to look at it. And I'm just knowing that this is like a temporary, it's temporary, and then we're gonna figure out what the new normal looks like together. Like I don't think that this is the new normal. I feel like this is the interim. This is a gray area where we're just trying to figure out what the new normal looks
Absolutely.
like.
And
So
here's to hoping that things kind of level out as we move forward. And it's not like this forever. I think there's one thing that IBD teaches us that I think we can be grateful for is, this too shall pass, right? It definitely teaches us some patience because it is a cyclical thing. I think we've been practicing for this for years.
100%. And I think patience and adaptability. I feel like adaptability is another thing, because it's like we can't necessarily make plans for anything because everything can change on the drop of a dime for us. So, when something like this hits, we know what it's like to adapt quickly to new obstacles. So, I think for some of us, like with chronic illnesses, it may have been a little bit easier to adapt
Absolutely.
to the
Can
change.
you tell me some things about your chronic illness and being diagnosed with ulcerative colitis and going through this journey of healing and navigating what it's like to live with IBD? Can you tell me some things that have generated some gratitude, some things that you're grateful for despite all the negatives?
I think some of the things that I'm grateful for, like one of the big things, is that I have such a better understanding of my body now. Like, and it's almost like I feel like I took my body for granted before, whereas now I know, I understand what certain foods do to my body. I understand what kind of reactions I'm going to get. Um, Whereas before I was diagnosed, I'm sure I was having IBD related symptoms and stuff, but I didn't know anything about it. So, I'd eat the wrong thing and I'd feel like crap. But I was like, oh, I bet you everybody feels like this. But through this journey, what I've learned is how big of a role certain foods play for me specifically. Not saying that what doesn't work with me won't work for somebody else, but there's certain foods that trigger me more than I do any other friend that has IBD. And I've just learned what foods I need to avoid, what foods will cause me like a lot of pain. And so I've also learned my tolerance for not just pain, but for just an obstacle, I suppose, because I never would have imagined if I were to go back like 10 years ago that I'd be sitting in this situation with a chronic illness and feeling more confident than I did prior to my chronic illness. So I've been able to find confidence through it by just understanding more about myself and understanding my boundaries and understanding that it's okay to have feelings. It's okay to talk about your feelings. Like I feel a lot more whole than I did 10 years ago,
I
even
couldn't
prior to
agree
having an
more.
illness.
It's amazing how I don't know where the connection between that just got missed in our society, right? Because I know for myself, I've gained a ton of confidence through this journey and learning, how to operate under these new circumstances and learning how to forgive myself for making mistakes and talk about what's going on with me. I honestly feel for men who are afraid or are resistant to do that form of self care. You know what I mean?
So, did you find when you were first diagnosed, how long ago were you diagnosed?
I was diagnosed in 2016.
Okay, so around like not too long after me, or around the same time, basically. So, did you find that you struggled a little bit at the beginning as well, kind of to get over that ego?
I still struggle with that,
Yeah.
right? I think it's pretty, you know, pervasive, the problem with the ego, right? When I also struggled with addiction, right? So
Hmm.
when I first got diagnosed with Crohn's disease, I didn't really care.
Hmm.
I was like, oh well, just another thing to deal with. And it wasn't actually until I started going into recovery and stuff that that perception started shifting for me.
What did you find was the most empowering? What in that process helped you kind of be like, you know what? Fuck it. I don't care. Like, I'm going to be me and I'm going to get through this. Like, what was it for you?
One of the first things I started doing was the exact same thing you did, and I started journaling. And then I started
Hmm.
journaling out loud, right? And then I started
Hmm.
connecting and meeting people, you know, similar to your journey, right? Where that connection led me to keep on seeking connection. And the more I spoke and the more I was honest with myself, the more connection I got. And it's much more of a fulfilling thing than any
Hmm.
kind of, you know, anger, drug, alcohol could possibly even wave a stick at, right?
Hmm.
And you know, so you created a
Well,
space. You have hidden spoons on Instagram. That's what it's called, correct?
hmm. Yeah.
And why don't you tell me a little bit about that space?
So, Hidden Spoons was basically a way for me to kind of honor the people who helped me through my journey. To was It was like sharing the stories of the people whose stories I had learned about, that I was impacted from, and I was able to find positivity, and like hearing all of the people's stories that are featured on there are the people that helped me overcome that ego, that helped me know I wasn't alone, helped me know that um, it gets better, and like so it's that's what Hidden Spoons was all about, and it actually originated from doing speaking engagements. So we'd started off by doing one event where we had 5 different people with different chronic illnesses come and speak to an audience, and we I rented out this theater locally. It was like a little opera house, and um, and we had 110 people show up to hear about all these people's journeys. And from there, that's where I was like, you know what, like I'm going to take this to social media, because there's so many people around the world that I talk to that have impacted me so much that obviously I don't have the means to bring them here to have them speak to an audience, but I do have the ability to talk to them and showcase what it was that they discussed that helped me feel so great. And um, so yeah, it kind of just became this place where I wanted to share stories of other people directly from their
Right.
mouths
Just
too.
a way to give back and show your gratitude, right?
Yeah, 100%. And you're on there as well.
I am on there. I remember when you asked me to
Yeah,
share my story, I was stoked.
yeah. And the interesting thing is, like, certain people that have shared their stories have reached out to me and they're like, "Hey, do you mind if I like share a new version of my story, because things have changed for me since the last time I shared, and I want to be able to update everybody on what's happened, because like there's been some big changes and some things I've had to overcome. So it's in a way been like cathartic for them too, to just share or update their own stories."
I love that. Like, I know when I go back and I read my old posts too, I'm like, holy smokes, like where I've come from there to here is incredible. Or I look
Yeah,
at it and I go, oh man, there's shit I need to work on. you
yeah.
know, it's like you say, I read in your blog, you said, we aren't able to start a new chapter if we keep rereading the last one. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, right?
Hmm.
You know, that
Yeah,
repetition. So it's about,
yeah,
you know, growing into yourself through this journey.
yeah. And I do find, like, obviously, like we're talking about what it's like for men in this situation, is that we because we try so hard to be strong all the time, that we don't realize that there's so much more strength in vulnerability, and like sharing your story and sharing your feelings doesn't make you weaker. In fact, it creates room in your life and in your mind and in your heart for bigger things. if you're able to get those things off your chest and get those things off your mind, you're creating a lot more room to fill it with stronger attributes, stronger characteristics, stronger um, just strength in general. So why not get those things off your chest? Because there's so much more power in vulnerability than there is in holding in your feelings.
Absolutely. And I think that's a shift that's beginning to happen. I don't know if we're quite there yet, but we are seeing more and more men who are willing to get in touch with that side of themselves. Did you find, I know you mentioned that you were kind of brought up being pretty open about this kind of stuff, but have you ever struggled with the fear of what other people are going to think if you do put yourself out like that?
Oh, 100%. 100%. And that's still, like you said, you still struggle with it. I still struggle with it too. Like it's, you know, just because anyone says they're confident or they're feeling confident doesn't mean that like nothing phases them. So like for me, like even like sometimes when I'm posting something, I get nervous. I'm like I'm going to post about this. Like, how are people going to receive it? Like, what are people going to think? What are
I
people
thought I
going?
was the only one.
Yeah. Well, even just like, I'm like, am I giving too much information? Am I giving too much of myself by posting this? So those are like thoughts that still go through my mind. But the only way that I'm ever going to get through that is by posting whatever I'm thinking or by saying whatever I'm feeling, and so that's that fight with the ego is, like not being afraid to do and say whatever's on your mind. And it doesn't mean like irresponsibly just like yelling random shit, but I'm like,
Right.
it's like you articulate what it is that you're going through, and some people may not like it. I mean, I've seen friends that are within our community be like, people have like called them out and said, "Oh, like you're only posting stuff like that because you're trying to get attention." And like, what kind of sick fuck is that? Like, who's gonna sit there to just post something so vulnerable about themselves just to get attention? Obviously, like majority of the people here are posting because they're wanting to raise awareness and they're wanting to get some sense of their lives back. Nobody's sitting here wanting to post this stuff just so they can garner some kind of attention, So it's it's interesting how people can think that way, but it's like, and those are kinds of the things that we worry about when, like, with stuff I worry about when I'm posting something. I'm like, oh my god, like, am I giving too much? Are people gonna think I'm just doing this for attention? Like, but really, I'm just wanting to create a dialogue. I'm wanting to create a space where people can discuss whatever it is that's plaguing them, going on in their mind, and they don't feel like they're being judged. Because as soon as someone's feeling judged, that's when they retreat and that's when they hold everything in and they're not going to let it out. So we have to be able to create environments that are allowing engagement.
Absolutely. Because it doesn't take much. It can only take one or two of those judgmental situations, and that can shut a person down. Right. I know for myself, I've been shut down before where I went, I am never putting myself out there again. Fuck these guys. Right. And man, that did not do me any good.
Yeah. Well, it's just so interesting because everybody goes through this where, as many good things as we can be told about ourselves, the things that stand out the most in our lives are always the negative things that have been said to us or the negative cards we've been dealt. So for however many hundreds of people you may have helped, if one person said to you something negative, that's going to stick with you, right? So it's just understanding. We have to also be able to dissect where that person might be coming from too. If they say something negative, is it coming from a place of ignorance? Is it coming from a place of, um, well, aside from ignorance, is it also coming from just their lack of knowledge, lack of empathy, lack of compassion? Like, so obviously we can't blame them. But, like, we can't blame them for thinking those things if that's like a product of their environment. But the thing that we can do is educate them so they understand where we're coming from, and maybe that would help them shift a little bit. But yeah, it's like so hard in those situations to shut yourself out and be like, oh my god, if that person says something negative to me, now I don't want to, like, I don't know if I want to like say anything ever again. But it's like, you know what, like, a friendly debate is totally good, and like you may be able to shift someone's perspective, you may not, but let there should be space enough for them to hear you out and space enough for us to hear them out.
Absolutely. I'm a firm believer that pain comes from pain, right? When I was angry, when I was judgmental, it was because I was afraid that people were judgmental towards me. So if I didn't let you get close enough, then we're good, right? And I think it's so common in men to push people away, not because they want to push that person away, but it's because they don't want to let them get close, right? And I think with chronic illness, I think that happens a lot where men just want to be treated the same. They don't want to look like they're weak. They don't want to be judged in any way, shape, or form. So they just keep everything to themselves, keep the symptoms to themselves. And I'm sure you've heard stories where that things get so bad before men say something that sometimes it can be fatal, right? What are your thoughts on that?
I am like the person who will always go, just like, especially now, like if something has changed with me, I know that I should like reach out to my doctor, or I'll reach out to my specialist and be like, hey, like this is what's going on. Is this cause for concern? Yes, no. And then, I have friends who will be dealing with something for a long time, dealing with like gut related issues and stuff, and they'll reach out to me and talk to me about it, but then they won't want to go to a doctor. And like, like I'm not a medical professional. Like I can
Yeah.
help you so much and I can tell you what I've been through, but by no means can I give you any kind of medical advice. So like maybe you should go to your doctor. And some of them are just like, oh no, like it'll pass. And just having that mentality is so dangerous, because sometimes just a matter of like weeks can be what makes an illness worse. So it's like we just can't take our bodies and our health for granted like that.
Exactly. It's like, come on, guys, just speak up. It's not a big deal, right? It's for your own good, man.
Yeah, I think it's just important to understand that it's okay to not be okay. And no one's going to judge you for seeking medical attention. No one's going to judge you if you need like mental health, like if you need to
Right,
like go talk to a therapist. Nobody's going to judge you for any of that stuff. In
right.
fact, like you don't even have to tell anybody. But you shouldn't allow yourself to shame yourself about those things, or make yourself feel any less than if you need any of those things, because we're all human, and at the end of the day, like there's no real formula for each of us. Like even with IBD, it's not like what works for me is going to work for you. Like we have complex bodies, complex minds, and we have to figure out what works for us individually. We have to figure out that cocktail, we have to figure out that formula, and don't be afraid.
That's exactly it, man. This is a little bit of a digression here. I just want to sidewind a little bit, going back to how much do you love unsolicited medical advice?
I feel like people have learned not to give me that much anymore now. Especially with one of our YouTube episodes, it was about like things not to say to people with a chronic
Right.
illness, and I think that might be one of our episodes that's gotten the most views too. And it's funny because like after I posted that, friends and family reached out and they were like, "Oh my god, like those are things I've said to you before,"
Yeah.
and so like now people ask more questions rather than giving more suggestions, which I think is better, because the thing is, so many people don't know about this illness. So when they're giving suggestions, it's like you're just giving suggestions to fill space, but you don't actually know the stuff. So a lot of people just ask me more questions now, like, how are you feeling? What does that mean? What's that? So as far as like unsolicited advice goes, for the first few years, not gonna lie, like it was crazy how many people told me to do yoga. And not to say it doesn't work for the mind, it 100% works for the mind, works for the body. But I was so far gone with my illness at that point, and I was like failing on a medication, and I was anemic. I was like, yoga is not going to get my red blood cell count back up right now.
You should have just had some celery juice.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, like, I'm not gonna. I've tried all of these things. I've tried celery juice. I've tried like meditation. I've tried yoga. I've tried, and not to say that they don't work. They do work, but you also need to be in control of your illness before you can really start to utilize those things as tools to help elevate you to the next place. Because if your mental health is completely down and your physical health is completely down and you're going to the bathroom a million times a day and you're shitting out blood and stuff, like at that in that moment, the last thing you want to hear is from someone is that you should go do yoga. You're like, I literally have no energy because all I keep doing is going to the bathroom. Like, I'm not going to do yoga.
Yeah.
So I think it's just for people to get a better understanding of like where you're at, what the situation is.
Yeah, absolutely. What are your thoughts? I know you talk about this a fair amount. I want to hear your thoughts on the connection between, mental, spiritual, and physical health.
Well, I feel like when you're mentally in a good space, you have more fight in you to fight. It's they all go hand in hand. So like if you are physically in a good space, then you will be able to tackle your mental health. If you're mentally in a good space, you'll be able to tackle your physical health because it's that weird balancing act of trying to if all chips are down in all of those areas, then what is going to lift you up to get you to tackle one over the other? So it's so important to find what's going to lift you up in certain areas. And not to say like my mental health is always like great now. Like fuck, like I've been struggling for the last 2 weeks with stuff. And it's the but the thing is I know what things I need to look after to then get my mental health up enough that I can start fighting the physical aspect of it, and vice versa. It's like, okay, if my physical health is down and I'm having a lot of symptoms, what are the things that I need to do that will keep those things at bay so that I can work on my mental health, and vice versa.
Right. It's almost like they piggyback each other, that one can't exist without the other.
Yeah, there's a mutually beneficial relationship between it.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more, man. Like mental health is so related to physical health that it's crazy. Like, you know, I can actually think myself into a flare. Like, have you ever experienced that before when being down and negative brings on physical symptoms?
100%. And it's weird because then you're like, shit, did I just manifest that?
Yeah.
But it's it's not that you're manifesting it, but it's they say that your gut is like a second brain, right? So
Yeah.
it does not strike me as like that crazy that if my my mind isn't in the right place, that my gut won't be in the right place. So if they work together, you gotta you gotta like give a little to get a little.
And I think it's also important to note that that's not necessarily a two-way street, right? Because, I'm sure you've had immediate onset flares when you're just happier than a pig in shit, right?
Yeah. And then in that situation, I know that it's something different. I'm like, oh shit, like maybe my medication isn't working anymore, or
Hmm.
maybe like maybe I ate something wrong, or maybe I need to like reassess my diet. So yeah, and that comes back to the having a better understanding of your body. It's like, well, I know that I'm mentally in a good space right now, and I might be experiencing some side effects or some symptoms. So what is doing that? And you kind of create that list. Some people you journal it, and like I know with the Gali Health app, you can kind of like track your stuff too. So like, yeah, it's just
Yeah.
like make sure that you're finding some sort of tool. If you don't have a good memory, write it down. Like write down what you ate that day. Write down what things have changed in your life in the last few weeks to kind of figure out what's maybe affecting you or creating those symptoms or the side effects. If you are mentally and physically feeling good, what was it then?
Yeah, I think it definitely turns into a pattern seeking endeavor, doesn't it?
Hmm. You just got to make sure that you don't go down that rabbit hole of like over dissecting everything you do.
Right.
Like you still want to live your life and still enjoy it.
There's definitely a certain aspect of YOLO going on where if you over restrict, then you're going to start bringing down that mental health of yours, and then you're taking that balance away, right?
Hmm.
Is there any other topics that you'd like to talk about or anything that you'd like to say to our listeners from a man's perspective that may be helpful regarding chronic illness and IBD specifically?
The biggest thing that I can stress is just making sure that you put that ego in check and just like know that it's okay to not be okay. Like you can literally you can believe that no matter what you choose to share with people, they will accept it. Like if you let your friends and family know you're not feeling well, they if they're if they've got your back, they've got your back no matter what. So like you can't don't let don't let it think that it's going to change how they treat you. Like of course it might change some things a little bit, but it's that adjustment period. And like we've got to like I said before, you can't keep rereading the same chapter and expect to move forward, you know? So if we just sit there and we go through that hamster wheel of our feelings and we're like, okay, well, I'm feeling this way, but I'm not going to share it because if I share it, then people are going to think this way. And we're just kind of creating the narrative for ourselves of how we think things are going to go. We're never going to allow ourselves to grow because um, how are we supposed to allow people to help us if we're already finishing the story for them and saying this is what's going to happen, this is how they're going to do it, and this is what's going to happen, so I'm just not going to share my feelings. It's like, no, dude, you got to like understand that it's not that black and white. It's not that like cut and dry. Like people will surprise you. That sometimes the people you think won't understand are the ones that understand the most. So just
Absolutely.
yeah,
People don't know you need help unless you tell them,
yeah.
right? One thing my mom always used to say growing up is, I can't read your mind,
Hmm.
right? If you don't
Yeah,
talk about stuff, how's anybody supposed to know?
exactly. And you never know how people are going to react to what you tell them either. Like you can be super nervous about telling people about what's going on with your health, and you're like, oh man, like they're not going to understand it, or they're going to make fun of me, or like whatever. And then they'll be the most understanding, and they'll open up to you about something that maybe they're experiencing, or someone in their family had experienced, and you're like, oh shit, like I didn't realize it was that close to home for you, and they'll be far more understanding than you ever gave them credit for. So it's like give credit to people and know that they will be there for you no matter what.
Exactly. I think I can honestly tell almost anybody that the connections will improve in your life if you start looking for the similarities instead of the differences,
100%.
right?
Yeah,
So, Ishmael, I'm going to hit you with some rapid fire questions. Are you okay with that?
of course.
Excellent. Number one, if you could go back and say one thing to yourself on the day after your diagnosis, what would it be? On spotlights on you. You don't have to be rapid.
You said rapid fire. I know. I know. One thing I said. Oh, okay. I was like that. That was a tough one. I would have told myself that it's not going to be as bad as you're thinking, because that was like the beginning of a new journey, and I was expecting that journey to be so fucking bad, um, and it's been like eye opening in so many positive ways.
Okay, when you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up? And how close to the mark are you?
I always used to say I wanted to be an architect, and I'm not an architect, but I do work in design, construction, and building. And like what I went to school was urban sociology, so it was all about building communities. So it was about, and I've worked for builders and developers, and we've built neighborhoods, and we've built high rises, and we've built so many things like that. And then now I'm doing it for myself, and then the whole building of community is now also I've found it to be useful now with mental health or the chronic illness journey as well. But yeah, so I feel like I've come kind of close to where I wanted to be.
You're definitely on the dartboard, that's for sure. That's cool, man. I'm nowhere near. I don't even remember what I wanted to be when I grew up, but I don't think this was it, but I'm glad this is it. All right, next. Everybody has guilty pleasures. What is something you indulge in that maybe you don't share with your followers?
milk and cookies. Ever since I was a kid, I will eat milk and cookies all of the time. The shitty thing is, when I was diagnosed, I was also became celiac, and now it's like finding a good gluten-free cookie is near impossible.
It's actually, I'm pretty sure it is impossible.
Yeah.
Maybe some of our listeners can throw some comments up in the bottom there, give us some suggestions.
Yeah, if somebody knows somewhere in Canada, somewhere even in like I live in Calgary, if you can tell me where to get a good goddamn like gluten-free cookie, I will be so happy.
I will order it from Zimbabwe if I have to.
Yeah.
All right, bro, you strike gold with a winning lottery ticket and money is no longer a concern. What is the first thing you do?
I would pay off debts for anybody that I'm close to. So like
that's nice.
So probably like for my families, like I would pay off their mortgages or whatever. And then, yeah, once I've like settled and taken care of the people that I want to, I would probably invest it in real estate and businesses and stuff.
Well, I'm going to have to get close to you then.
Well, who said I'm going to win the lottery? Man,
hey, man, you never know. You got the same chance of winning whether you buy a ticket or not, though. That's the only problem.
It's true.
Okay, bro. What is your biggest fear and how do you overcome it?
I think my biggest fear has always been failure. That's like one thing that I've always been worried about. And yeah, whether it was in school, whether it's professionally, that's one thing that I've always really struggled with. And I think that's why I work so hard is because I'm like, I just don't want to fail. But that's, I don't know, that's what it is.
I feel you.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty common one.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Ishmael, I'd like to thank you a ton for coming on the show today. It was amazing hearing your stories and your insights. If anybody would like to check Ishmael out, he has on Instagram, Razzie blog, at Hidden Spoons as well. And you can also find him on YouTube. Help Us YYC. That's a good podcast.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Excellent. So thanks again for coming on the show. And
thanks for having me.
You are welcome. We'll talk to you soon.
In an IBD world ravaged by toxic masculinity, two friends set out on a journey to break the stigma. Hi, I'm Ishmael.
And I'm Tim.
We're the hosts of the new Hidden Spoons podcast, presented by Gali Health.
Join us. We will touch on topics like vulnerability, entrepreneurship, stomas, sexuality, and so much more.
Our goal is to break down the stigma and shame, and sometimes toxic masculinity that can keep some men from feeling comfortable in their respective health journeys.
We may make you laugh, we may make you cry, but most importantly, we will help you understand that it's okay to not be okay.
Join us as we interview some incredibly inspirational guests, and we break down their journeys and dive deeper into how they found strength in their illnesses.
Keep an eye out for us and follow us on Instagram at hidden.spoons and at Gali Health for more updates.